Gorelick.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Let me start with you, Mr. Verga, kind of follow up on what Mr. Benveniste's been asking about, but from a different angle. We have what used to be a SINC and now a combatant commander for every part of the world except the United States. And the American public, I think, would find it interesting to know that if you have a combatant commander for a particular area of the world, that person probes the intelligence to see what the threats are, does scenario planning against those threats, trains, makes sure that troops are trained against those missions, exercises against those missions and against those threats. You have given what I expect is a very accurate description of what we have, by contrast, inside the United States. That is, you are in a support mode to civil authorities, basically. You have some border security functions, consequence management, of course, aerospace warning, but basically you are in service of civil authorities that have a command structure that doesn't remotely resemble, as we've heard today and certainly before this, does not remotely resemble the unitary, clear command responsibility that a SINC or a combatant commander has. Now, in my experience, had we had such a person here in the United States prior to 9/11, that person would have probed the intelligence, not necessarily on individual people, but on the nature of the threats, and might have practiced against that scenario and might have, for example, pre-positioned aircraft in a different manner than they were indeed pre-positioned. Would you agree with that scenario that I've just drawn?
Let me just address a couple things. The United States Northern Command, which was created and became effective on the 1st of October of 2002, is the command which is responsible for the geographic area of the world, which includes the United States. They have a mission that's divided into two parts. The protection of the United States territory, interests, etc., from external threats and aggression, and to support civil authorities as ordered by the President and Secretary of Defense. As part of their first mission, they do, in fact, do exactly what you said: analyze intelligence, look at threats, look at the positioning of defense forces to deal with those external threats and aggression. The difference is that let's take the 9/11 attack, for example. The prevention of the hijacking of the aircraft is, in fact, not the job of the Department of Defense. It's the job of now the Department of Homeland Security or the Transportation Security Administration. Dealing with those hijacked aircraft after they had become weapons aimed at the United States would, in fact, be the mission of the Department of Defense, and we position our defense forces accordingly. At the time, our defense forces were positioned in accordance with the perceived air threat against the United States, which was external threats to the United States. So therefore, we were looking outward, not inward, not looking at external threats that manifest themselves internally, if that's not an inconsistent statement. Currently, every single day, United States Northern Command looks at the available intelligence and then arrays the air defense forces in accordance with their estimation of where the most probable need might arise. But we still look to the civilian agencies to prevent the hijacking of aircraft. The obvious last thing that you want to have to do is to shoot down a civilian aircraft that had been hijacked. So therefore, we would expect that no civilian airliner would be allowed to take off if there were a doubt that would require us to be better positioned to shoot that aircraft down.
All right. So just to be clear, let's talk about the pre and post 9/11 environment. Post 9/11, is the commander of Northern Command, operating as the functional equivalent of the combatant commanders elsewhere in the world in terms of responsibility for assessing the threat, ensuring that scenario planning is done against those threats, ensuring that people, troops, et cetera, are trained for missions that would meet those threats.
That's correct. Consistent with their mission statement, and also consistent with the fact that while he's a geographic combatant commander like any other, the area of operation is in fact unique because it contains the government of the United States, 54 sovereign states and territories to deal with. So it's not exactly the same as being an overseas combatant commander, but in terms of the mission to defend the United States and respond to consequence management requirements, he does all those things that you said.
Prior to 9/11, was there any person who had that functional equivalent role to assess the intelligence with regard to the threats against the United States that might occur domestically, and to address those scenarios by scenario planning, training, pre-positioning of all the means of defense? Was there any single person who had that role prior to 9/11?
No single one. The responsibility for defense was actually divided in two parts. Air defense was the responsibility of North American Aerospace Defense Command, and land and maritime defense was the responsibility of Joint Forces Command, which was headquartered down at Norfolk, Virginia.
And did they have the same analog response? In other words, for the person who had responsibility for our air defenses on that day, was that person charged with understanding the full panoply of threats to our nation's security from the air, addressing scenarios that might arise as suggested by that intelligence, and pre-positioning both individuals that were appropriately trained and equipment to meet those threats?
I would have to answer yes to that question. I would also have to qualify that yes by saying that the emphasis of the defense activities of the United States at that particular time were external. I don't think there was anybody who was, again, concentrating on an external threat manifesting itself internally to the extent I believe your question implies.
Thank you for that very straightforward answer. Mr. Bonner, a question for you. We have heard that there were 33 hijacker entries and 2 referrals to Customs secondary inspection. And I'd like to address one of them, which was Walid al-Shehri, who, as I understand it, he was, there was a secondary inspection report that states that a secondary inspection was complete, and he was not permitted entry into the Bahamas and returned to Florida by Bahamian immigration. And so my question to you is, could it be that someone who would be rejected by the Bahamian authorities would be accepted by us? And if so, under what circumstances and what would we do about it?
Well, first of all, I know nothing whatsoever of any report you might have with respect to a secondary inspection on al-Shehri. So there may have been one, and it may have been INS, it may have been Customs, but I have no idea. I've not seen the report. So it gets very speculative. I don't even know how to begin to answer that. But if he were a non-immigrant who was not otherwise entitled to enter the United States, obviously one would hope that he would not have been permitted to enter the country. I have no idea if, in fact, I have to assume you're hypothetical because I do not have any knowledge of the facts.
Well, maybe what we'll do rather
he was turned down by the Bahamian government. I mean, the question would be, why was he refused entry there? Was it because he required a visa and didn't have one? Did he have a proper visa to enter the U.S.? I mean, there are too many facts that I just don't have at my command to answer that question.
I'm sorry, I should not have presumed your familiarity with this, and what I will do is ask the staff to review with you what I'm referring to, and maybe you can give me your comment.
Be happy to provide a response to you.
Mr. Ziglar, I was struck in reading your testimony about how thematically similar it was to Doris Meisner's testimony with regard to the development of policy in the immigration area and the political environment in which the INS has had to function. You refer very strikingly to funding inadequacies, to the failure of Congress to respond to your restructuring plan, which was a modification or a carrying forward in some respects of Commissioner Meisner's restructuring plan. You've told the story about what happened to you when you tried to make a seemingly modest proposal with regard to the visa period. And the two elements of what you say and what Commissioner Meisner said are really the same. One is that we need, as a country, to have a much more balanced and thoughtful approach to immigration. But in fact, what we have is policy development characterized by a highly politicized environment, an agency buffeted by both inconsistent, knee-jerk pendulum swings of points of view and inadequate funding. Now, you've been a student of the INS, and certainly Doris Meisner has been for decades. Would that be a fair characterization of your view of the way in which we view immigration policy and the consequences that might have for the security of our nation?
I think that's a good characterization of it. I've had the opportunity since I left the commission to be a fellow up at the Kennedy School, thinking and talking about this issue, and then teaching at George Washington Law School in the area. And I've had the good fortune for the last year really to be able to study the history in very great detail. What we're experiencing and what we've experienced in the last decade or 2 decades in immigration is not new. Our schizophrenia or ambivalence or whatever words you want to have about it goes back really literally back to the late 1700s. And we have periods throughout our history where this has been true. The one thing that struck me in my study of the history of immigration is that the one policy area that the executive and the judicial branches give the most deference to is immigration. I can't think of, based on my study, any other place where the Congress has literally more control of a policy area, from the funding to the execution, through the means that Congress can do. And so, given an issue like immigration, which divides the country and has divided it so many times, it's not surprising to me that we have been going back and forth, and that you get some laws, but nobody wants to fund it. Everybody gets a little something, and as a result of it, what we end up with is a system that doesn't work and sometimes can't be enforced, or even if it could be enforced, we don't have the resources to do it.
So I take it your view then is that with this high level of deference to the Congress and the highly politicized nature of immigration in our body politic, that the result is an agency less competent, less able to proceed fairly, and perhaps less able to protect us. Would that be your view?
I would take the word competent or incompetent out of that. Sure, we had incompetent people. We have incompetent people in the private sector. We have incompetent people in other agencies. I worked up here in the Senate for many years. We even had some incompetent people up here. But the fact is that the folks at the INS were overwhelmed. And there's a certain factor when you're overwhelmed that just kind of paralyzes things at times. So that's the way I would characterize it.
Yes, I wasn't casting aspersions at all on the tens of thousands of very able men and women who have worked in the immigration area over the years. I mean, it was one of my pleasures to supervise the agency for a period of time when I was at the Department of Justice. But I was referring to the difficulty of acting competently when you have shifting requirements, inadequate funding, and fear of retribution when you try to do your job. Thank you very much for your comments.